The sky was the pale gray of breath frozen in the air, the kind of cold that made sound travel slow. High on the ridge, the wind combed through spruce branches, and below, a man in a worn buffalo coat swung his axe in a steady rhythm. He was broad-shouldered, mid-40s, face carved by years of mountain winters, his hair shot through with early frost. The cabin behind him stood alone, timbers dark with age, smoke curling from the chimney like a quiet promise. The world he knew was one of few words and fewer visitors. The mountains had a way of keeping to themselves, and so did he. But that morning, between the sound of axe biting wood and the low groan of trees shifting in snow, something else reached him, thin and strange, like rope rubbing against wood. He straightened, listening. The wind carried it again, a small, strained creak, and under it, the faint scent of char. He left the axe where it fell and followed the sound toward the old trail into town. The snow was deep, each step sinking to the shin, his breath steady clouds before him. The closer he came, the sharper the smell of burnt timber, though the fire that had once raged here had long since turned to memory. The abandoned barn loomed ahead, its roof half collapsed, black scars crawling up the siding. At first, she looked like a trick of the wind, a pale figure swaying against the dark wood. Then he saw the truth. A young woman, maybe 25, hair the pale gold of wheat under frost, hung by her wrists from a crossbeam jutting from the roofline. Her boots brushed the drift beneath her, toes barely catching the snow. Across her forearm, blackened letters marred the skin, the flesh blistered and angry. Comanche Lover. The burn still smoked in the cold air. He stood still, not from hesitation, but from a need to steady the weight inside his chest. She was not struggling anymore, only turning faintly with the wind, her eyes half closed, lips moving as though speaking to someone he could not see. The knife in his belt came free, without thought. In 2 strokes, the rope gave, and she fell into his arms like something too light for the harm she'd carried. Her skin was ice-cold, breath shallow, the charred letters standing out like cruel handwriting on paper too fine to bear it. From the shadows of the nearby buildings, faces watched, women holding curtains just enough to peer through, men leaning on doorframes. No one came forward. The air between him and the town was brittle with unspoken judgment. He shifted her in his arms and began the long walk back toward the trail, each step grinding into the snow. She stirred against him, her head falling against his shoulder. Her lips formed a word he didn't know, a name, maybe, and it had the weight of something spoken far from here, in a language the mountains did not often hear. He gave her water from a canteen at his side. She drank weakly, her eyes flickering open just enough to meet his. There was no fear in them, only a kind of guarded watchfulness. Then she slipped back into the dark of fever. The trail was steep and winding, the snow a deep hush around them. By the time he pushed the cabin door open, his breath was rough in his chest. Inside, the air smelled of pine resin and ash. He laid her on the narrow bed near the fire, the quilt beneath her worn soft from years of use. Water warmed on the stove as he cut away the stiff, smoke-stinking sleeve of her coat. The wound was ugly, blisters raised, the skin around them angry red. He dipped a cloth into the water, squeezing it cool over her arm. She flinched, eyes opening again, catching the firelight. For a moment, she studied him, not the way people often did, measuring size or strength, but as if she were deciding whether this was a place she could let her breath out. She didn't speak for a long while. When she did, her voice was dry, low. She said she had lived in a border town. She said there had been a man, and there had been trouble. Whether he had been her love or her friend, she didn't say, only that he was Comanche, and he had once saved her life. The rest she left to silence, but the outline was enough. A brother who betrayed her to quiet his own fears, neighbors eager to make an example of her, the brand burned in not to mark truth, but to carry their lie. He didn't tell her the townsfolk would come looking again. He didn't ask what she'd done before or where she meant to go next. The fire crackled between them, and the wind outside rattled loose shingles on the roof. Her gaze drifted to the small window where snow feathered down against the glass. The lines of her face were tired but unbent. When he offered her a bowl of broth, she took it with her left hand, the burned arm lying still on the quilt. When she had eaten, he banked the fire and let her rest. She lay with her back toward the wall, her breath evening into the rhythm of deep sleep. He stayed in the chair by the hearth, watching the shadows move along the floor. Through the walls came the sigh of the wind, soft and steady, the the kind of sound that told him the ridge would hold through the night. Still, he kept the rifle leaning against the doorframe. It was late when the last log collapsed into glowing embers. Her hand, the burned one, had fallen from the quilt, palm up as though offering something unseen to the dark. He sat there, the weight of the day settling in, and realized the thing that had moved him most was not the cruelty of what had been done, but the quiet fact she had survived it at all. The snow kept falling, wrapping the cabin in white. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the town still whispered her name, like a curse. Here, in the small circle of warmth he had made, it didn't seem to matter. He leaned back in the chair, the firelight soft on the lines of his face, and thought, not about the trouble she carried, but about the strength it might take to set it down. The night deepened, the wind smoothed over the trail they'd taken, and the world outside went still. And yet, under it all, there was the faint hum of something new beginning. The thaw came slow that year. Days lengthened, but winter clung to the mountains like a secret it wasn't ready to give up. The woman moved through the cabin with quiet steadiness, no longer the half-frozen stranger he had carried through the snow, but not yet someone who belonged to this place. She wore his spare shirts, sleeves rolled, the collar hanging loose at her throat. The burn along her forearm had healed into a dark ridge scar, and though she kept it covered, her hand was steady when she worked. He didn't ask her name again. She had told it once in a voice that carried something unspoken with it, and that was enough. What mattered was how she stood beside him now, mending a split in the water pail, or sorting dried beans at the table, or walking the ridge with her hair loose in the wind. They spoke in pieces, small words between chores, a quiet remark about the weather, the way the snow on the far peaks caught the evening light. But each word felt earned. There was a kind of honesty in not filling the air just to push back silence. Sometimes he caught her looking toward the narrow valley below, where the trail wound toward town. It wasn't longing in her eyes, but a watchfulness, as though expecting a shadow to take shape there. When he asked if she wanted to leave, she said no, only that she'd learned not to be surprised by footsteps coming for her. One morning, while they were splitting wood, a rider passed at a distance along the valley trail. He didn't wave or slow, but the woman's hands paused on the kindling. By nightfall, he heard the first rumor, men in town speaking her name again, saying she'd been taken in by a man too simple to know better. Words like soft and fool were being thrown in with her name, and other words meant to cut deeper. The wind changed that night, carrying with it the smell of smoke from the low country. She didn't sleep much. Neither did he. The next afternoon, hoofbeats came up the valley. For riders, dark coats, rifles slung easy but ready. The man set down the pail he was carrying, wiping his hands on his trousers. Inside, she had just taken bread from the oven, the air warm with its scent. When she heard the approach, she froze, the loaf still in her hands. He stepped outside before the riders reached the clearing, boots crunching in the thin crust of snow. The sky was the color of pewter, the light flat and cold. The men pulled up at the edge of the yard, steam rising from their horses' nostrils. They didn't bother with pleasantries. One of them, broad through the shoulders, called out that they'd come for her. Said she was marked, and folks didn't take kindly to seeing her walk free. The man didn't move toward his rifle. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, but his voice carried in a way that made the still air feel heavier. "She's under my roof," he said. "She stays." The broad-shouldered one spat into the snow. Said it wasn't his fight. Said they could take her without spilling blood if he stepped aside. Inside the doorway, she had set the bread down, her eyes fixed on the space between the man and the riders. Her right hand hung near the wall where his second rifle rested. The moment stretched. The man felt the wind shift, a faint bite in it that meant snow would fall again by night. The leader's hand twitched toward the rifle on his saddle. A sharp crack split the air. Snow fell from the eaves in a soft rush. The shot hadn't come from him. In the doorway, she stood with the rifle snug to her shoulder, smoke curling from the barrel. The bullet had passed close enough to the leader's head to make him flinch. Her eyes were steady, her voice low but clear enough for all to hear. "Next one won't miss." For a beat, no one moved. Then one of the riders shifted in his saddle, muttered something under his breath. The leader glared at her, then at the man, and finally jerked his reins. The horses turned, hooves breaking through the snow crust, carrying them back toward the valley. The man didn't speak until the hoofbeats faded. Then he stepped toward her, taking the rifle from her hands, not to disarm her, but to set it aside. She didn't look away from him. There was no trembling in her now, only the quiet knowledge of what it meant to stand when the ground was trying to pull you down. She told him later that the Comanche man she had known had taught her to ride, to shoot, and to hold a line no one could push her from. Her voice didn't break when she said his name. Days passed without another sign of the riders. The snow began to retreat from the ridge, revealing the dark, damp earth beneath. She worked alongside him without asking what came next. He didn't ask either. Some answers only showed themselves in their own time. One morning, they saddled his mare and an old bay that hadn't been ridden since summer. She swung into the saddle as if she had never forgotten the motion. They rode toward the high ridge where the wind carried the scent of pine and distant rain. At the crest, they stopped. The world spread below them, valleys, hills, the long curve of river. She closed her eyes and let the wind catch her hair. For the first time since he had found her, she smiled without anything shadowing it. They stayed there until the light began to fade, the two of them outlined against the wide sky. It wasn't the end of trouble. The mountains held no such promises. But as they turned the horses back toward the cabin, the air between them felt as sure as the trail they rode. Some folks would say a man's worth is measured by the weight he can carry in his hands. He knew better now. Sometimes it was measured in the way you carried someone else's story without letting it fall, and in the choice to stand when no one else would. If you love heartfelt Wild West tales of courage and redemption, saddle up and subscribe for more stories by the fire.